Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday, February the 21st, 2024. Interesting piece I read recently in Unheard about all of us being prisoners in Plato's cave. The idea that we're looking at shadows and we are still grasping at reality. Of course, in a sense, I guess we're all prisoners still of Plato's Republic, still the most influential book in the Western canon, particularly these days when it comes to democracy and its crises. Plato wrote it, but it's a book above all about Socrates, the great Athenian, 5th century Athenian philosopher, troublemaker, a man eventually put to death. So in a sense, if we're in the shadow, so to speak, of the cave, most of all, we remain in the shadow of this man, Socrates. And that is indeed the title of a new book, a very intriguing new book by my guest, Matt Gatton, The Shadows of Socrates, the heresy, war, and treachery behind the trial of Socrates. Matt Gatton is based in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and his background is as a philosopher and as an aesthetician of light. So it's perhaps not surprising that he's drawn to Socrates and this metaphor of the cave, and he is indeed joining us from Santa Fe. Welcome, Matt. Congratulations on the new book. Have I guessed right, or am I wrong? Was your initial interest in Socrates and this idea of being in the shadow, is it derived from your interest in light?
Absolutely. Yes, I guess my obsession with ancient Greek culture began as a small child. So there was a portrait of a Greek great-grandfather who had long since deceased on the wall in one of those oval frames with the convex glass. And I would just peer into his eyes, and the house was stacked floor to ceiling with books, and I just became a little ancient Greek obsessed child, and that just continued on. In fact, in grammar school, the teacher asked us, which famous person or living dead would you like to speak with? And all the boys in the class chose Evel Knievel, but I chose Phidias.
Yeah, I'm sure that made you popular with your with your fellow students. Coming back to this idea of being prisoners in Plato's cave, is this imprisonment, is it associated with light? Is the imprisonment one of darkness in metaphorical terms? Is that what you think Plato or Socrates is trying to teach us in the Republic?
Right. So the allegory of the cave has just had huge metaphorical power just down through the centuries, because it speaks to the human condition and it speaks to our questions about reality. What I did in terms of my specialty is the use of physical light in ritual and aesthetic settings in prehistory and antiquity. So light is my specialty, and the other side of light, of course, is shadow. So archaeologists began to ask me questions about various built spaces back through time, and I was mainly focused on Paleolithic and Neolithic when a question was presented to me about the mysteries of Eleusis. So the mysteries of Eleusis is this very important religious ritual in ancient Athens. And the question presented to me was, for more than 2,000 years, how does the goddess Persephone manifest as this apparition of light at the climax of this ritual? So I was strictly focused on how the goddess was manifested from a physics perspective. Like, how would they use the optics to make the goddess appear? So the problem with the Mysteries of Lucis is, if you ever spoke about the Mysteries of Lucis, it was a death penalty. So it's capital punishment if you say anything untoward about the Mysteries of Eleusis. So what I was able to do was figure out how the priest, the Hierophant, was able to conjure the vision of the goddess through a very simple optical technique. What I did not anticipate was, in figuring out that ritual, was that it had uncanny resonance to the allegory of the cave, which then makes you read the allegory of the cave very differently. The allegory of the cave goes from being just a profound discussion of the human condition to a blatant act of heresy.
Yeah, so light, in a sense, or discussing light or using light as the metaphor for existence, is a very dangerous thing. And your book, The Shadows of Socrates, focuses on his trial. Of course, as I said, he was put to death, and we've always romanticized the death in civic terms of Socrates. For people watching, here's the great painting of the 18th century French artist David, The Death of Socrates. Was Socrates' most dangerous challenge to Athens his use of light, his presentation of light as an essential truth?
Exactly. So Socrates is charged with two crimes: impiety and leading the youth astray. So the impiety means lack of reverence for the gods. So that's a religious crime. So when he repurposes the Mysteries of Eleusis, he converts this very hierarchical religious structure and flips it on its head. So the light of Persephone is the accepted truth of the religion of the time. And then he makes the image of Persephone into a cast shadow. And then he makes the philosophical truth of light the paramount experience. So he takes the religion, he consigns it to a shadow, and he makes intellectual pursuits the god of the time. So that's going to get you killed. Like, that is just blast.
You're asking for trouble. So
yeah.
The book is called The Shadows of Socrates. Let's take Socrates out of the shadows, philosophically or otherwise. Tell us about this man. I mean, he presented himself, at least through Plato, as a rather ugly fellow, a troublemaker, someone who would sit around and argue with Athenian citizens all day. What's your take on what he was like, Socrates? Was there really somebody called Socrates?
Oh, indeed, absolutely, because multiple ancient authors describe him, and they describe him generally as the same curmudgeon. Although his student Plato is the source of the bulk of information about Socrates.
And can we trust Plato? I always wonder about Plato.
Right. Well, that's always the question when you're talking about something written more than 2,000 years ago. You have to look at the author's filter. But because Xenophon and others described Socrates pretty much in the same way, doing the same things, I think we have a pretty good picture of who Socrates was, except that I think the way he's taught today is sort of divorcing the ideas from his actual life. He was a war hero, an absolute defender of Athens. I mean, his ability, I mean, these testimonies about his ability to go without sleep, to go without food, to just be ferocious in war. Like, he's a veteran of 3 campaigns. He famously, when the young aristocrat Alcibiades goes out beyond the lines and is cut down and left for dead, Socrates single-handedly goes out there and fights his way out to him, but straddles him and fights off the opposition until he can lift Alcibiades on his shoulder and carry him back behind Athenian lines. So he's a much more interesting person than is I think is commonly understood.
His love affairs documented in some ways in Plato. Love affairs. He was supposed to be married. Love affairs with young men too. But was his greatest love affair with the Athenian Republic? Was that the thing that he loved most of all? And is that why, in the classic narrative, that he was willing to sacrifice his life?
I think so. I mean, his greatest love in life was sparring with words about ideas to try to improve the citizenry of Athens. And you're right, the romantic entanglements of ancient Athenians is just amazing. So you could just probably put it down that everybody slept with everybody. But you're right. His one great love is distinguishing between the just and the unjust. And like the figure in the allegory of the cave, is leading people from the darkness, from the shadows, from the world of illusion to the true light of philosophical attainment.
Izzy Stone, the great muckraking 20th century progressive journalist, wrote The Trial of Socrates, a book which did very well. Mm-hmm. What, in your view, were Socrates' politics? For progressives, they've embraced Socrates, like Izzy Stone. But was he a man that we wouldn't today associate on the left? Or was he simply someone who challenged everything and everyone?
Well, I think he very clearly sees the flaws of any form of government and rightly points them out. I think that he tries to develop a couple of philosopher kings, people who would rule from reason for the greatest good, as opposed to their own lust for power. Two of his former students do end up achieving power, and they pretty much destroy Athens with their
that's Alcibiades, and who else?
Critias. He's the leader of
I mean, and you obviously know a lot more about this than me. You've written a book about it. You've spent a lot more time reading and thinking about it. Mm-hmm. But was he really somebody who was sympathetic to the idea of a philosopher king? Wasn't, from at least Socrates, wasn't it a warning against philosopher kings? Plato liked the idea of a philosopher king. But the great tension in the Republic is between Socrates' version of democracy, which is rather dirty, and Plato's, which is a technocracy ruled by philosopher kings. Or is that wrong?
No, I don't think that's wrong. I think the issue is that democracy falls twice during the heyday of Socrates, and two of his former students are the cause. So, I mean, there's this wonderful line in his examination of Alcibiades where he says, you know, I fear that the power of the state will be too much for you, and that ends up being true. So I know there are a lot of people who will interpret various Socratic things as that he's anti-democracy, but he's certainly not pro-oligarchy, because the 30 tyrants were going to kill him. You know, had they not been deposed themselves in another civil war, he was a goner. So, I mean, a lot of what he said about politics, as recorded by Plato, is prophetic.
Yeah, and I want to get to, obviously, the relevance today, because there's a lot of relevance.
Right.
In Plato's Last Days of Socrates, mm-hmm. it seems, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, that Socrates was given the choice of freedom, but it would mean him having to leave Athens. Is that true? Did he choose death over exile?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But there's more to it than just he was making a principled decision. The reality was they had already hunted down and killed Alcibiades. that it didn't. He knew that no matter where he fled, they were going to hunt him down, and kill him too. And the real risk was that if he didn't take his medicine, drink the hemlock, and die, then most of his colleagues were going to get killed too. So after Socrates is executed or for suicide, however, after he drinks the hemlock, his whole cadre of buddies, including Plato, they take off. Like Plato doesn't come back to Athens for 12 years. He doesn't come back until it's safe to come back. He doesn't come back until the religious leader, a man named Callias, who happened to be Alcibiades' half-brother, is no longer in a position to kill all of Socrates' buddies.
Matt, what do you think Socrates would have thought of the civic republican idealism of Aristotle, of course, who came after Plato and Socrates?
No idea. He was dead and gone by then.
Well, you must have. I mean, that tradition in antiquity through Aristotle has been picked up by a number of contemporary political philosophers, particularly Hannah Arendt. Would Socrates have been, if he was around today, would he be a civic republican?
I really can't even conjure a guess on that. I mean, one of the things is that when James Madison goes about construct, let me back up.
And that's a small R. It's not a big R. I'm not talking about the American
right, of course.
Party.
Yeah, I mean, we live in America. We live in a republic. I mean, but the reality is, after the democracy, the democratic republic disappears in antiquity, it doesn't show back up until these United States of America thousands of years later. And the flaws of ancient democracy that were exploited by Alcibiades and others, that Socrates described, those writings were consumed by James Madison, and he tried to construct a system of checks and balances to make sure that democracy didn't fall again. Now, yeah.
It's good stuff, Matt. We're going to take a short break, and then I want to talk about exactly what you just touched on, the idea of warning us about Socrates being, in the shadows of Socrates being, a warning about the current state of America. I want to get back to Alcibiades and the militarization of Athenian democracy. But before we do that, I want to take a short pause, remind everyone that this show is brought to us in part by Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics. Lots of great stuff in Liberties. They often have interesting essays on antiquity, certainly on Socrates and on the idea of liberalism. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Matt to talk about the shadows of Socrates in the early 21st century, what Socrates should and shouldn't teach us about the trials and tribulations of American democracy in the 2020s. So don't go away, anyone.
Beyond the news, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Matt Gatton, the author of The Shadow of Socrates. Fascinating new book about the heresy, war, and treachery behind the trial of Socrates. Matt, you had an interesting piece in Crime Reads, the sister publication to LitHub, where this show also is distributed, on the bloody rivalry that led to the fall of democracy in Athens, of course, relevant today. Already in the first half of the show, you mentioned a man called Alcibiades several times. Tell us about Alcibiades and how his role is relevant in your narrative, The Shadows of Socrates.
Right. So, again, Socrates is charged with impiety, the religious crime, and leading the youth astray. So it's pretty important you understand who the youth were and how he led them astray. So Alcibiades is one for the ages. He grows up in the house of the famed Athenian general Pericles with a half brother named Callias. And
And Pericles, of course,
Mhm.
many people consider him the father of Athenian democracy in his famous speech about defending Athens.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, he's the greatest orator in the history of the world. I mean, Pericles is, I mean, rightfully
The Washington of or the Lincoln of Athens, Pericles.
Oh, oh yeah, no doubt. He's. I mean, the golden age of Athens is called the age of Pericles for a reason. In fact, you mentioned Lincoln. His Pericles's speech for the Athenian war dead is pretty much the template for Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Like if you take now Pericles is 3,000 words and Lincoln's is only like 300 words, but if you just distill the best lines that hold that last Lincoln's is 3 paragraphs. So that last paragraph is pure Pericles. That's pure Pericles. Yeah, I mean Pericles is, I mean, so I mean, Alcibiades grows up in this aristocratic household in the seat of power. He is the handsomest man in ancient Athens. He's a sex addict. He sleeps with everybody.
There's a little bit of the JFK about him.
Right. Yeah, very much so. He's a rich, self-aggrandizing bombast of a personality.
But very good looking, very charismatic in his own way.
Right. And probably one of the most persuasive public speakers of all time. And he basically teaches his teacher Socrates that morality cannot be taught, because Alcibiades is as amoral as you can imagine. So where to start with that guy?
So I don't want to, bring up the T word, but is there a little bit of Donald Trump in Alcibiades as well?
Oh, absolutely. It's a personality type. So Alcibiades, well, see if this sounds familiar. So he's this wealthy braggart who tells an outrageous lie that causes Athens to take down its democracy, which triggers a civil war. He's a sexual predator. He profits from his office. And then after he gets impeached, he leaves with the state secrets. Now, the next thing that Alcibiades does is he turns traitor to Sparta. Now,
let's remind everyone, Matt, what Sparta was and why it's in such vivid contrast to Athens.
Yeah, so Athens and Sparta are sort of locked in this competition for control of all of Greece. So these are two city-states in Greece that are vying for control over the whole shooting match. And they are constantly at war with each other.
But Sparta, of course, offers a very different model than Athens, whereas Athens was the laboratory of democracy. Sparta was the laboratory of a strict military dictatorship.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So,
and what was Alcibiades? Was he attracted to the Spartan model, or did he not care as long as he came out of it looking good?
He was a chameleon. So his half brother Callias, the priest of Eleusis, sentences him to death for profaning the mysteries of Eleusis. So Alcibiades, instead of coming to court, he flees, and then he turns traitor to Sparta. He moves to Sparta, adopts Spartan ways, and because he knows everything about Athens as a former Athenian general, he basically coaches the Spartans on how to destroy Athens. And the first step he makes is he teaches the Spartans strategically, he's a strategic genius, how to take the silver mines, which is the source of Athens' wealth. Now, the person who owns the silver mine concession is his half-brother Callias, who had just sentenced him to death. So he's getting back at Callias he's using the Spartans to get back at Callias. But Athens ends up under siege and on the cusp of collapse. with Alcibiades teaching this or directing the Spartans on how to take down Athens. And Athens is about to fall when the Spartan king finds out that his wife, Queen Timea, is pregnant with Alcibiades' kid.
There's a bit of a soap opera about this one. Again, it reminds us perhaps of what's happening in America. So how does this tie back in with the trial of Socrates? The subtitle of the book is The Heresy, War, and Treachery Behind the Trial of Socrates. Was all this happening simultaneously with the trial? How was it connected? And how was Alcibiades' behavior, his betrayal, bound up with the trial?
Right. That's a very good point. So now Alcibiades is going to do a lot worse stuff than he's already causing Athens to be without food. There's starvation, disease. Like he's destroying Athens because he's bitter at his brother Callias. Now, eventually, Athens is going to have strong feelings about Alcibiades, and they're going to look to blame somebody for all the damage that Alcibiades caused. And his teacher Socrates is going to be a convenient target.
Okay, so for you in your argument, Socrates was the revenge of the state for the behavior of Alcibiades was the death of Socrates.
Well, that's the second part of the charge, the corrupting the youth. Like you have to know which youth got corrupted, and the big two are Alcibiades and
so in a sense, and I'm not justifying the trial or certainly the execution of Socrates, but in a sense, was the accusation of the state right? Did Socrates corrupt Alcibiades, this brilliant young aristocrat for whom power went to his head? He might have been better off staying in his military academy and not being corrupted by Socrates.
I think Alcibiades was born corrupt, and Socrates did the best he could with him. Teachers across time, even today, get significant credit for their high-performing students. And for Socrates, that's Plato. And teachers get blamed for their low performers. And for Socrates, that's Alcibiades. So the trigger for the charges against Socrates is the allegory of the cave, the heresy.
Although Plato himself doesn't come out smelling completely of roses. I mean, he spent, as you say, a life in exile trying to establish military, sort of technocratic military dictatorships around the Eastern Mediterranean. So he's not Socrates either.
No. I mean, if you lived in ancient Athens where people are just being hauled in, I mean, all sorts of petty grievances get turned into charges, and people get convicted for just nonsensical reasons. So they had real reason to want to put some guardrails on.
So let's finally, Matt, let's fast forward. As I said, you had a piece in Crime Reads, the bloody rivalry that led to the fall of democracy in Athens, the clash of two Athenian leaders with ties to Socrates. Obviously, the allusions to our current crisis of American democracy are not hidden. What is all this? What's the relevance of this, of your book, and of these ideas to the current state of American democracy?
Right. Well, we are living in the same moment. Now, that was a different time, different technology, but so Alcibiades in exile, he makes a move to return to power, and he takes advantage of the civil war he caused. And several years later, when the desperate Athenian assembly votes him in as autocrat, Athens' goose is cooked. Like Athens goes from being the crown jewel of the ancient world, from being the height of art, architecture, science, economy, medicine, to being crushed by Sparta because of Alcibiades. So the moment we're living in now, where an individual who has certain character traits like Alcibiades is been put out of power is trying to return to power. It has happened before, and it did not end well.
And it's funny talking to you. I try not to think about narratives with Trump because everyone's already thought of them. But I wonder, one potential narrative is he loses the next election, argues about it, and goes into exile in Russia, which might really reflect history repeating itself in terms of Alcibiades and Athens, given that Russia is not Sparta, but it's certainly the Sparta to American democracy.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So there's a bunch of stuff that it's already happened that is similar to what happened in ancient Athens. And if past is prologue, there could be a second chapter, which is a gruesome chapter where almost everybody dies, and the state dies, and then Alcibiades dies too. Like everybody dies. So it is not a good scenario. But yeah, you could absolutely see fleeing somewhere else to avoid trial and taking state secrets. There are just some uncanny similarities there for sure. Also to Zaphod Beeblebrox, so from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So they're a reference.